The white walls of the medical facility seemed to close in around Zexhai as he sat in the metal chair. His forearms hung at his sides, but his two smaller arms would not stop shaking. They had been shaking for 3 months now, ever since he ran away from the war. Dr. Velnara watched him from across the small table. She was tall and thin with blue skin and large black eyes. Her people had been part of the Galactic Council for over 1,000 years. They understood war, but they did not understand what had happened to Zexhai. "Tell me again why you left your unit," Dr. Velnara said. Her voice was soft, but Zexhai could hear the confusion in it. "Your file says you were the best soldier in your division. You had medals from 12 different battles. Your commanders trusted you completely." Zexhai's red scales rippled as he tried to find the right words. How could he explain what the humans had done to him? How could he make her understand the terror that lived in his chest now? The fear that woke him up every night. "The humans," he whispered. "They were not like the others." Dr. Velnara nodded and made notes on her datapad. "Yes, I have read the reports. The war lasted much longer than expected. But your people have fought difficult enemies before. The rock creatures of Terminus held out for 2 years. The machine builders of Vex Prime fought for 3 years before surrendering." "No," Zexhai said, his voice getting stronger. "You do not understand. Those others fought hard because they were desperate. They fought to delay the end. The humans fought to win." The doctor set down her pad and leaned forward. "Explain the difference." Zexhai closed his eyes and tried to remember the beginning. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had only been 4 years since the Hegemony fleet first entered the human solar system. He had been so confident then. They all had been. "We studied their planet for months before the invasion," Zexhai said. "Earth was perfect for conquest. The humans were divided into hundreds of small nations. They fought each other constantly. Their weapons were primitive. They had no real space fleet, just a few small stations around their planet and their moon." Dr. Velnara nodded. This was the standard pattern. The Hegemony always chose targets that were weak and divided. It made conquest easier. "Our war computers calculated that Earth would fall in 18 days, Zexhai continued. "The humans had nuclear weapons, but not many. Their armies were small. Most importantly, they had no unity. How could a species that could not even unite their own planet possibly stand against the Hegemony?" "But something went wrong," Dr. Velnara said. "Everything went wrong." Zexhai's smaller arms began shaking harder. "The moment our ships appeared in their outer system, everything changed. We monitored their communications, expecting panic, surrender offers, or desperate attempts to hide. Instead, we heard something else." "What did you hear?" "Coordination." The word came out like a curse. Within 6 hours of our arrival, every human military force on their planet had stopped fighting each other. Every nation, every army, every space station, they all began working together. It was impossible. Species do not do that. When faced with overwhelming force, they break apart. They blame each other. They fight over who will surrender first. Zexhai stood up and began pacing the small room. His heavy footsteps echoed off the walls, but not humans. "They became stronger when we threatened them. Their leaders spoke to each other for the first time in years. Their armies shared weapons and information. Their scientists began working on projects together. In one day, they became more united than most species manage in centuries." Dr. Velnara made more notes. This was unusual but not unheard of. Some species do unite when faced with external threats. "For a few days, maybe weeks," Zexhai said. "Fear can bring people together temporarily. But fear also makes them weak. It makes them desperate. It makes them make mistakes." He stopped pacing and looked directly at the doctor. "The humans were not afraid. That is impossible. All species fear death." "No, you misunderstand me." Zexhai sat back down, his voice becoming quiet again. "They feared death. But they feared failure more. They feared letting their species down. They feared not fighting hard enough. They had turned their fear into something else, something that made them dangerous." The room was silent for a long moment. Dr. Velnara reviewed her notes, trying to understand what Zexhai was telling her. "The first battle was near their gas giant planet Jupiter," Zexhai said. "We sent 50 ships to destroy their outer defenses. They had maybe 20 ships to defend with, small, weak vessels that should have been destroyed in minutes." "But they were not. They were destroyed," Zexhai said. "All of them. But not in the way we expected. Instead of trying to run or surrender, they attacked us directly. Their ships were slower than ours, their weapons weaker, so they did something that no military computer could predict. Dr. Velnara waited for him to continue. They rammed us. Zexhi's voice was filled with disbelief. Even now, ship after ship, they pointed themselves at our vessels and flew straight into us at maximum speed. Some of them rigged their engines to explode on impact. Others filled their cargo holds with explosives. They turned their own ships into weapons. Desperate tactics, Dr. Velnara said. No, that is what we thought too. But we monitored their communications. These pilots were not screaming in terror or begging for their lives. They were calm. They were giving each other technical advice on how to cause maximum damage. They were joking with each other. One pilot sang a song while he flew his ship into our cruiser. Zexhi stood up again, his agitation growing. We destroyed their defense fleet completely, but they took 8 of our ships with them. 8 ships lost to 20 primitive vessels. The mathematics made no sense. Our commanders were confused but not worried. We still had over 150 ships left. What happened next? We moved toward their inner planets. Earth's moon had defense stations and the planet Mars had colonies. Standard procedure was to destroy these quickly, then demand Earth's surrender. But as we moved inward, we detected something strange. What? Massive energy readings from Mars. Construction sounds from their moon. Radio chatter that suggested they were building something. In the 3 days it took us to reach the inner system, they had somehow turned both locations into fortresses. Dr. Velnara frowned. In 3 days? That seems impossible. We thought so too. Our intelligence said that human construction projects took months or years to complete. But we learned something important that day. When humans are motivated, they work very differently than during peacetime. Zexhi sat down heavily, his scales dulling to a darker red. We had made our first mistake. We assumed humans would behave like every other species we had conquered. We thought they would become weaker under pressure, more frightened, more divided. Instead, they became something else entirely. What did they become? Zexhi looked up at Dr. Velnara with eyes that had seen too much. They became what they needed to be to survive. And that, Doctor, was when I first began to understand that we were not fighting a normal war. We were fighting something that the galaxy had never seen before. Dr. Velnara poured water into 2 cups and offered one to Zexhi. His hands were steadier now, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. The soldier took a small sip and continued his story. The attack on their moon bases was supposed to be simple, Zexhi said. We had done this same operation dozens of times before on other worlds. Send in the ground forces, overwhelm the defenders, capture the facilities intact for our own use. But the humans did not follow the expected pattern. Nothing about the humans followed expected patterns. Zexhi set down his cup and stared at the table. We sent 3 assault groups to different points on their moon. Each group had 200 soldiers, enough to take most planetary capitals. The first group landed near their main mining facility. Zexhi paused, his breathing becoming faster. What happened to the first group? Dr. Velnara asked gently. Gone. All of them. The humans had turned the entire mining complex into a trap. They knew exactly where we would land because they understood our tactics better than we understood theirs. When our dropships touched down, the ground beneath them exploded. The doctor made notes but kept her expression neutral. She had heard of ambush tactics before. The second group landed near their communications array, Zexhi continued. They managed to get inside the facility, but the humans had filled it with some kind of gas that was harmless to them but deadly to us. 20 soldiers died in the first minute. The rest had to retreat. And the third group? That was my group. Zexhi's smaller arms began their familiar trembling. We were supposed to capture their main habitat dome where most of the humans lived. It should have been the easiest target, civilians with no military training. But it was not easy. Zexhi laughed, but there was no humor in it. Doctor, do you know what humans do to their children? The question surprised her. I am not familiar with human child-rearing practices. They teach them games. Strategy games, puzzle games, competitive games. From the time they can walk, human children learn to think tactically. They learn to solve problems under pressure. They learn to work together in teams. Zexhi looked up at her. We thought we were fighting civilians. We were actually fighting a population that had been training for war their entire lives without knowing it. Dr. Velnara felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? The habitat dome was not filled with frightened families hiding in their homes. It was filled with organized groups that had turned every room, every corridor, every air vent into a weapon. The human children were running messages between adult fighters. The elderly humans were operating sensor equipment. The adults were using mining tools, kitchen knives, even furniture as weapons. HFY stood up and walked to the small window that looked out over the medical facility's gardens. But the worst part was not their weapons or their tactics. The worst part was their attitude. They were not desperate. They were not afraid. They were excited. Excited? Yes, we monitored their communications during the battle. They were encouraging each other, sharing ideas, celebrating small victories. One human female used cleaning chemicals to create a bomb that killed 6 of my soldiers. When it worked, we heard her laugh with joy and immediately start teaching others how to make the same weapon. Dr. Velnara set down her pen. That seems unusual behavior for civilians under attack. It gets worse, HFY said. After 6 hours of fighting, we managed to corner a group of humans in their main living area. We expected them to surrender or beg for mercy. Instead, they started asking us questions. Questions? Technical questions. They wanted to know how our weapons worked, how our armor was made, what planets we came from. They were studying us while we were trying to kill them. HFY turned back to face the doctor. One human male, wounded and bleeding, spent his last minutes alive trying to take apart one of our energy rifles to understand how it functioned. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air circulation system. Dr. Velnara tried to process what HFY was telling her. We eventually took the dome, HFY continued, but it cost us half our force. Worse, we realized the humans had been recording everything. Every weapon we used, every tactic we employed, every weakness they discovered, it was all being transmitted back to Earth. They were gathering intelligence. More than that. They were learning. Within hours of our attack on their moon, humans on Earth had developed countermeasures for our weapons. They had figured out weaknesses in our armor. They had analyzed our attack patterns and created defenses. HFY sat back down, his expression growing darker. The commanders were frustrated but not worried. We still had overwhelming numerical superiority. We had better ships, better weapons, better technology. The humans had gotten lucky on their moon, but Earth itself would be different. Was it different? Oh yes. It was much worse. Dr. Velnara waited for him to continue. The assault on Earth began 3 weeks later. We bombarded their major military installations from orbit just like we always did. Their defenses were primitive, surface-to-space missiles that our shields could easily stop. Within 2 days we had destroyed most of their military infrastructure. That sounds successful. It should have been. Any normal species would have surrendered at that point. Their armies were broken, their weapons destroyed, their governments in chaos. But the humans did something that had never happened before in the history of hegemony conquest. What did they do? They got better. HFY's voice was barely a whisper. While we were destroying their old weapons, they were building new ones. While we were attacking their military bases, they were turning their entire planet into a military base. While we were following our standard conquest protocols, they were writing new rules for war. HFY reached for his water cup, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold it. 3 weeks into the ground invasion, everything changed. The humans stopped fighting like the defensive force of a conquered planet. They started fighting like they were the ones invading us. I do not understand. They had learned our language from captured equipment. They had figured out our communication codes. They had studied our tactics so thoroughly that they began predicting our moves before we made them. HFY looked directly at Dr. Velnara. Doctor, have you ever been in a fight where your opponent knew what you were going to do before you knew it yourself? Dr. Velnara shook her head. It is terrifying beyond description. We would plan an attack, and the humans would already be prepared for it. We would try new tactics, and they would have counters ready. It was as if they could read our minds. How is that possible? Because they had turned war into a science. Every battle, every skirmish, every individual fight was being analyzed, studied, and improved upon. The humans were not just fighting us, they were experimenting on us. HFY stood up again, too agitated to sit still. After 2 months of ground fighting, something impossible happened. We started losing battles. Not just taking heavy casualties, actually losing. Human forces were capturing our equipment, our vehicles, even our soldiers. And every time they captured something, they found ways to make it better. Better how? Our energy weapons were designed for hegemony physiology. Humans modified them to work better for their smaller hands and different fighting styles. Our armored vehicles were built for our homeworld's gravity. Humans changed them to work better on Earth. Our communication systems were coded in our language. Humans broke the codes and then used our own equipment to coordinate attacks against us. Zexhai sat down heavily, his breathing ragged. By the end of the 3rd month, we were not fighting humans using human weapons. We were fighting humans using improved versions of our own weapons. They had become better at being us than we were. Dr. Velnara stared at her notes, trying to understand the implications of what she was hearing. That is when I first thought about deserting, Zexhai said quietly. Not because I was afraid of dying. Every soldier accepts that possibility. But because I realized we were not fighting a war anymore. We were teaching the humans how to destroy us, and they were very good students. The next day, Dr. Velnara found Zexhai sitting in the same chair, staring out the window. He had not slept well. The medical sensors in his room showed he had woken up screaming 3 times during the night. "Are you ready to continue?" she asked softly. Zexhai nodded without looking away from the window. The Mars campaign. That was when everything changed for me personally. Dr. Velnara sat down and prepared her recording equipment. "Tell me about Mars." The Hegemony Command decided that Earth was taking too long to conquer. The humans were adapting too quickly, learning too fast. So they decided to take Mars first, use it as a staging area for a larger assault on Earth. That seems logical. It would have been logical against any other species. Zexhai finally turned to look at her. But the humans had spent the first 6 months of the war turning Mars into something that should not have been possible. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Mars was supposed to be lightly defended. It was a mining colony with maybe 50,000 people. Most of them were scientists and engineers, not soldiers. Our intelligence said they had basic life support systems and some mining equipment. Nothing that could threaten a real military force, but the intelligence was wrong. The intelligence was 6 months old. We learned that humans can accomplish in 6 months what takes most species 6 years. Zexhai began his familiar pacing. When we arrived at Mars, we found something that defied all our understanding of engineering and logistics. What did you find? They had turned the entire planet into a fortress. Not just the surface, the whole planet. Every cave, every canyon, every underground tunnel had been converted into a defensive position. The mining equipment had been turned into weapons. The life support systems had been turned into weapons. Even the planet's atmosphere had been turned into a weapon. Dr. Velnara looked up from her notes. How do you turn an atmosphere into a weapon? The humans had figured out that most hegemony species need specific gas mixtures to survive. So they modified their atmospheric processors to create localized zones of different air compositions. They could make areas that were harmless to them but deadly to us. Zexhai sat down, but immediately stood up again. My unit was assigned to capture the main mining complex in Valles Marineris, the big canyon system. It should have been a simple operation. Land our ships, march in, overwhelm the defenders with superior numbers and firepower. What went wrong? Everything. The moment our first dropship entered the canyon, we realized the humans had been watching us for weeks. They knew exactly how many ships we had, what weapons we carried, even which units we came from. How could they know that? Because they had turned the canyon walls into sensor arrays. Thousands of tiny cameras and listening devices, all connected to underground computers. They could see and hear everything that happened in a space that was hundreds of kilometers long. Zexhai walked to the wall and pressed his hands against it, as if trying to push through to somewhere else. But seeing us coming was just the beginning. They had spent months preparing for our specific attack patterns. When we landed, we found that every landing zone we might choose had been rigged with explosives. Every path we might take had been blocked or trapped. Every piece of cover we might use had been turned into a killing zone. They anticipated your tactics that precisely. Better than that. They had multiple plans for every possible thing we might do. If we came from the north, they had Plan A. If we came from the south, they had Plan B. If we split our forces, they had Plans C through G. They had even prepared for tactics that we had never used but might have developed during the battle. Dr. Velnara set down her pen, struggling to understand the implications. How is such preparation possible? Because the humans think differently than we do. When we plan a battle, we think about what we want to accomplish. When humans plan a battle, they think about every single thing that could possibly happen. And they prepare for all of it. Zexhai turned back to face her, his scales now a deep, troubled red. We landed in 3 groups, just like our manual recommended. The first group was immediately hit by landslides that the humans had rigged with explosives. Half our soldiers were buried before they could fire a shot. And the other groups? The second group made it into the complex, but the humans had modified the mining tunnels. What looked like solid rock walls were actually hidden doors. Humans would appear behind us, attack, and then disappear into passages that we could not find. Zexai's breathing became faster as he remembered. The third group, my group, was supposed to secure the main entrance. We advanced carefully, watching for traps, but the humans had done something that our training never prepared us for. What? They had studied our psychology. They knew that hegemony soldiers are trained to watch for obvious dangers, explosives, ambush points, weapon emplacements. So they made the real trap completely invisible. Dr. Velnara waited for him to continue. The main entrance looked safe. Our sensors detected no weapons, no explosives, no hostile forces. So we went inside. The trap was not in the entrance itself, it was in the air. The air? The humans had filled the entrance chamber with a colorless, odorless gas that was harmless to them, but caused immediate paralysis in our species. 20 soldiers walked into that chamber. 20 soldiers collapsed within seconds. Zexai sat down heavily, his head in his hands. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. Dr. Velnara waited. Human civilians came out to help us. Help you? They gave us medical treatment to keep us alive. They provided breathing apparatus that filtered out the gas. They even gave us food and water. Zexai looked up at her with confusion still clear in his eyes. Doctor, we were invading their world. We were trying to kill them and take their homes. But when we were helpless, they helped us. That seems contradictory. That is what I thought. But while they were helping us, they were also questioning us. Not torture, just questions. They wanted to know about our homeworlds, our technology, our military structure. And because they were being kind to us, some of my soldiers answered. Dr. Velnara made notes, trying to understand this unusual approach to warfare. Within 3 days, the humans knew more about hegemony military organization than some of our own officers. They knew our supply lines, our communication codes, our reinforcement schedules. They had turned our own soldiers into intelligence sources without using any force at all. What happened to your captured soldiers? That is when I truly began to understand how different humans are from every other species. Zexai stood up and walked to the window again. They released us. Released you? All of us. Every captured soldier was given medical treatment, food, and safe passage back to our ships. The humans said they did not want to be responsible for prisoners during a war. Dr. Velnara frowned. That seems strategically unsound. We thought so too. Releasing captured enemies makes no tactical sense. It allows them to return to battle and use their knowledge against you. Zexai turned back to her, but the humans had thought several steps ahead of us again. What do you mean? The soldiers they released had been treated well by humans. They had seen that the enemy could be merciful, even kind. When they returned to our units, they carried that knowledge with them. It affected morale in ways that our commanders did not expect. How? Some soldiers began to question why we were fighting. If the humans were savage primitives like our propaganda claimed, why had they shown mercy? If they were inferior beings, why were they winning battles against superior forces? Zexai's smaller arms began trembling again. But the real reason the humans released us became clear 2 weeks later. Every soldier who had been captured had been implanted with a tiny tracking device. So small that our medical scanners could not detect it. The humans knew exactly where our ships were, where our bases were, where our commanders were. They were using you as unwilling spies. Yes, and when they finally launched their counterattack against our Mars positions, they knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. In one night, they destroyed supply depots that we thought were secret, captured command posts that should have been impossible to find, and eliminated key personnel who should have been safe behind multiple layers of security. Dr. Velnara stared at her notes, trying to process the implications. The Mars campaign was supposed to last 1 week. It lasted 4 months, and at the end of those 4 months, we were not occupying Mars. The humans were occupying our ships. How is that possible? Because while we were trying to conquer their mining colonies, they were building a fleet. Using captured hegemony technology, human engineering principles, and raw materials from Mars itself, they had constructed ships that were faster and more powerful than anything in our Navy. Zexai sat down one final time, his voice becoming very quiet. On the last day of the Mars campaign, I watched human ships chase our fleet out of the solar system. Ships that had been built by hand in mining tunnels, crewed by civilians who had learned to fly by studying captured enemy pilots. What happened to your unit? Half were dead. A quarter were captured. The rest of us retreated to the outer system and waited for reinforcements. Zexhai looked directly at Dr. Velnara. That was when I started having the dreams. What dreams? Dr. Velnara noticed that Zexhai had not touched his food during their break. The soldier sat staring at the meal tray as if it might attack him. His smaller arms were trembling more violently today. The nightmares are getting worse, she observed. They are not nightmares, Zexhai said quietly. They are memories. And memories of things that have not happened yet. Tell me about the final phase of the war. Zexhai pushed the food tray away and began his story. After Mars, the Hegemony High Command decided to end the war quickly. The humans were becoming too dangerous to leave alive. They sent the entire reserve fleet, 300 ships with over 1 million soldiers. That seems like overwhelming force. It should have been. But the humans had spent the previous year doing something that no species in galactic history had ever accomplished. Zexhai looked up at her. They had turned their entire planet into a single military installation. Dr. Velnara waited for him to continue. When we returned to Earth, it was not the same world we had left. Every continent had been reorganized for warfare. Every city had been converted into a fortress. Every human civilian had been trained as a soldier. How could they mobilize an entire planet so quickly? Because they had something that we had never encountered before. Absolute unity of purpose. Every human on Earth understood that this was a war for the survival of their species. And when humans believe their species is threatened, they become something else entirely. Zexhai stood up and began his familiar pacing. The landing on Earth was supposed to be the final assault. We would overwhelm their defenses with sheer numbers, occupy the major population centers, and force their governments to surrender. But that is not what happened. The first sign that something was wrong came during the landing approach. Our ships detected massive energy signatures all across the planet. Not just weapons, construction. The humans were still building things even as we were attacking them. What were they building? Everything. Weapons, vehicles, spacecraft, underground facilities. But most importantly, they were building something that we had never seen before. Hybrid technology. Dr. Velnara looked up from her notes. Hybrid technology? They had taken our captured equipment and combined it with their own technology to create new devices that were better than either original. Human creativity combined with hegemony engineering. It should not have been possible, but they made it work. Zexhai stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair. My regiment was assigned to capture Sydney, one of their major cities. Intelligence said it had 3 million civilians and minimal military defenses. We landed with 50,000 soldiers and advanced confidently toward the city center. What did you find? We found that Sydney no longer existed as a civilian city. The entire metropolitan area had been converted into a 3-dimensional battlefield. Buildings had been connected with bridges and tunnels. Streets had been blocked or turned into channels for moving military equipment. The harbor had been filled with floating weapons platforms. Zexhai's breathing became faster. But the real shock was the people. We expected to find frightened civilians hiding in their homes. Instead, we found organized military units that moved and fought like they had been soldiers for decades. How is that possible? Because humans do not separate civilian and military roles the way other species do. When their survival was threatened, every human became a warrior. Children operated communication equipment. Elderly humans served as lookouts and intelligence gatherers. Adults fought with weapons they had built themselves using captured hegemony technology. Dr. Velnara made notes, but she was struggling to understand the scope of what Zexhai was describing. The battle for Sydney lasted 3 weeks. By the end, we controlled maybe 10% of the city. The humans controlled the rest. Plus, they had captured most of our heavy equipment and were using it better than we could. How could they use your equipment better than you? Because they modified it. Zexhai's voice was filled with a mixture of admiration and terror. Our weapons were designed for specific purposes and specific users. Humans took them apart, figured out how they worked, and rebuilt them to be more efficient, more powerful, more versatile. He sat down and stared at his hands. I watched a human female take apart one of our energy cannons with simple tools. She studied it for 2 hours, then rebuilt it with modifications that increased its power by 30% and reduced its weight by half. She had no formal engineering training. She was a school teacher before the war. That level of improvisation seems impossible. That is what we thought. But humans do not think like we do about technology. We see a device as having one purpose, one correct way to use it. Humans see every device as a collection of parts that can be recombined into something better. HFY looked directly at Dr. Velnara. By the second week of the Sydney battle, the humans were not just defending themselves with our weapons. They were attacking us with weapons that we had never seen before, and combinations of human and hegemony technology that should not have been possible. Give me an example. They took our gravity, manipulation technology, and combined it with their magnetic field generators to create weapons that could bend our armor plating like soft metal. They took our energy shields and combined them with their laser technology to create defensive systems that actually got stronger when attacked. HFY's smaller arms were shaking violently now, but the worst thing was not their weapons. The worst thing was their attitude. What do you mean? They were enjoying themselves. The words came out like a confession of something shameful. These humans were fighting for their lives, watching their city being destroyed, seeing their friends die, and they were having fun. Dr. Velnara set down her pen. That cannot be accurate. I monitored their communications myself. During battles, they would joke with each other. They would celebrate successful tactics. They would congratulate enemies who used clever strategies against them. One human soldier actually thanked me after I shot him because my attack had taught him something useful about hegemony weapons. That is not normal combat psychology. No, it is not. And that is when I realized what made humans so dangerous. They were not fighting because they had to. They were fighting because they wanted to. They had turned war into a game, and they were very good at games. HFY stood up and walked to the window. The final assault on Sydney was supposed to end the war. We brought in our most powerful weapons, our best soldiers, our most experienced commanders. We were going to crush the human resistance once and for all. What happened? The humans surrendered. Dr. Velnara looked up in surprise. They surrendered? Yes. After 3 weeks of fighting, they sent representatives to our command post with an offer of complete surrender. No conditions, no demands. They would lay down their weapons and submit to hegemony rule. That seems like victory. We thought so too. Our commanders were celebrating. The war was finally over. We had won. HFY turned back to face her. But something felt wrong. The human representatives were too calm, too confident for people who had just lost everything. What was wrong? It was a trap. The biggest, most complex trap in military history. HFY's voice became very quiet. While we were focused on Sydney, the humans had been building something in secret. Not just in other cities, but in space. In space? Remember how they had captured so much of our technology? How they had learned to improve our designs? While we were fighting for one city, they were using captured hegemony ships and equipment to build a fleet in hidden bases throughout their solar system. Dr. Velnara felt a chill run down her spine. The surrender ceremony was scheduled for the next morning. Representatives from all the major human governments were going to formally submit to hegemony authority. Our entire command structure was planning to attend, but they did not surrender. Oh, they surrendered. Exactly as promised. And while our commanders were accepting the surrender of Earth, the human fleet attacked every hegemony position in the solar system simultaneously. HFY began pacing again, more aggressively this time. In 6 hours, they destroyed or captured 90% of our ships. They took our space stations, our supply bases, our communication relays. By the time our commanders realized what was happening, the human fleet was already heading for our home systems. How is such coordination possible? Because the entire war had been planned from the beginning. Every battle, every defeat, every piece of technology we lost, it was all part of a larger strategy. The humans had been playing a game that lasted years, and we never even realized we were playing. HFY stopped pacing and looked directly at Dr. Velnara. That night, I received a personal message from a human commander. It was addressed to me specifically by name and rank. The message said, "Thank you for your service as a training partner. We could not have learned so much without your help." A training partner? Yes, the entire war had been a learning exercise for them. They had used us to understand galactic military technology, tactics, and psychology. Every battle had been a classroom. Every defeat had been a lesson. Zexhi's voice became a whisper, and now class was over. The humans were ready to graduate. The final session took place in a different room. Dr. Velnara had requested a space with no windows, no outside views. Zexhi had been having panic attacks whenever he saw the stars. Today he sat in the chair with his eyes closed, as if trying to shut out the world entirely. "Tell me about the last day," Dr. Velnara said gently. Zexhi opened his eyes and stared at the blank wall in front of him. The last day was not a battle. It was a lesson. A lesson about what happens when you teach the wrong species how to fight. He was quiet for a long moment before continuing. After the human fleet destroyed our forces in their solar system, they did something that no victorious species had ever done before. They followed us home. Dr. Velnara felt her throat tighten. They left their own system. Not just left it. They turned their entire civilization into a mobile war machine. While we were retreating to our home worlds, they were building ships and following our fleet across the galaxy. How could they track you across interstellar distances? Because they had been studying our technology for years. They understood our navigation systems better than we did. They knew our trade routes, our supply lines, our homeworld locations. Information that should have taken centuries to gather, they had learned in 4 years of war. Zexhi stood up and began pacing in the small, windowless room. But tracking us was not the worst part. The worst part was what they did to themselves during the journey. What do you mean? Humans adapt, Doctor. It is what they do. During the months it took to reach our space, they were modifying themselves, their ships, their weapons. By the time they arrived at our first colony world, they were not the same species we had fought on Earth. Dr. Velnara set down her pen. Modified themselves how? They had used captured hegemony medical technology to enhance their own bodies. Improved reflexes, enhanced strength, better resistance to different environments. But more than that, they had improved their minds. Their minds? They had found ways to increase their intelligence, their memory, their ability to process information. The humans who arrived at our colonies were smarter, faster, and more capable than the ones we had originally fought. Zexhi stopped pacing and pressed his hands against the wall. Our colony worlds fell in days, not months. The humans had learned everything we could teach them, and then they had taught themselves things we never knew. They were using technologies that we had never seen, strategies that we could not understand, weapons that should not have existed. What happened to your homeworld? That is where I was when I finally deserted. Zexhi's voice became very quiet. The human fleet arrived at our home system with over 1,000 ships. Ships that they had built using our own technology, but improved beyond anything we could have imagined. Did they attack immediately? No, they sent a message first. A message that was broadcast to every hegemony world simultaneously. What did the message say? Zexhi closed his eyes and recited from memory. People of the hegemony, you came to our world to teach us about conquest. You have been excellent teachers. Now we would like to teach you something in return. We would like to teach you about evolution. Dr. Velnara felt cold despite the warm room. The message continued. You believed that might makes right, that superior technology guarantees victory, that primitive species cannot threaten advanced civilizations. These beliefs are now extinct. We are what happens when you give a species like ours the motivation to evolve. And then they attacked? No. Zexhi opened his eyes and looked directly at her. They offered us a choice: surrender completely and accept integration into human civilization, or face complete extinction. Integration? They wanted to absorb us, not as slaves or conquered people, but as citizens of their expanding empire. They offered to share their technology, their knowledge, their improvements, but only if we abandoned everything that made us hegemony. What did your leaders decide? Some worlds surrendered immediately. Others tried to fight. The ones that fought lasted hours, not days. The humans had become something that our weapons could not hurt. Our strategies could not predict. Our technology could not match. Zexhi sat down heavily, his entire body shaking now. I was on the last ship to escape our home world. As we fled, I watched through the viewing ports as human ships landed on our planet. But they were not coming as conquerors. They were coming as improvers. Improvers? They immediately began modifying our cities, our technology, our entire infrastructure, making everything better, more efficient, more advanced. Within weeks, our homeworld was producing technology that was centuries ahead of anything we had ever built. And the people? The ones who stayed were offered the same modifications that the humans had given themselves. Enhanced bodies, improved minds, extended lifespans. Many accepted. Those who did were no longer really hegemony. They were something new. Dr. Velnara tried to process what she was hearing. That is when I realized the true horror of what we had done. Zexhai continued. We had not fought a war against humans. We had accidentally created something that had never existed before. A species that could improve other species against their will. Against their will? The improvements were so obviously beneficial that refusing them seemed insane. Who would choose to remain weak when they could be strong? Who would choose to stay stupid when they could be smart? Who would choose to die young when they could live for centuries? Zexhai looked up at Dr. Velnara with eyes full of terror. But once you accept the improvements, you are no longer what you were before. You become part of their collective, part of their expanding civilization that grows stronger with every new species it absorbs. Where are the humans now? Everywhere. Zexhai's voice was barely a whisper. They are not expanding like a normal empire, conquering territory and enslaving populations. They are expanding like an infection, improving everything they touch and making it part of themselves. And you escaped? I did not escape. I was allowed to leave. Zexhai stood up one final time. 3 months ago, a human ship found my escape pod drifting in deep space. They brought me aboard, fed me, treated my injuries, and asked me questions. What kind of questions? They wanted to know about other species, other civilizations, other potential students, as they called them. They were gathering information about the galaxy, preparing for their next phase of expansion. Why did they let you go? Because I am a messenger. A warning, a preview of what is coming to every species in the galaxy. Zexhai walked to the door of the room. They want everyone to know that the humans are coming, and they want everyone to have time to decide. Evolution or extinction? Dr. Velnara looked at her notes, trying to find some hope in what she had heard. Surely some species will be able to resist? Zexhai paused at the door and looked back at her. Doctor, have you ever tried to resist an improvement to yourself? If someone offered to make you smarter, stronger, healthier, and more capable, would you refuse? I do not know. The humans have learned something that no other species has ever understood. You do not conquer civilizations by defeating them. You conquer them by making them better than they ever imagined they could be. Zexhai opened the door and stepped into the hallway. They will be here soon, Doctor. And when they arrive, they will not come as invaders. They will come as teachers. They will offer to improve us, to enhance us, to make us part of something greater than ourselves. And if we refuse, Zexhai's final words echoed down the empty corridor, then we will discover that extinction is also a form of evolution, just not the kind that survives to see tomorrow. Dr. Velnara sat alone in the windowless room staring at her notes. Outside, she knew the stars were shining. The same stars that had once seemed distant and peaceful now felt like eyes watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. Somewhere among those stars, humans were traveling from world to world, species to species, offering the same choice that Zexhai had described. And with each species that chose improvement over extinction, they became stronger, smarter, more capable of offering that choice to the next civilization they encountered. Dr. Velnara closed her notebook and walked to the door. She had a report to write, a warning to give to the Galactic Council, but as she reached for the door handle, she found herself wondering, when the humans finally arrived at her world, what choice would she make? In her heart, she already knew the answer, and that knowledge terrified her more than anything Zexhai had said.